Welcome to the place, and this is the place where I do enjoy orange. I mean, that's a wonderful color. It's also a nice fruit. With that said, we're going to have a good show tonight. We have two outstanding individuals who really are competent, and that is in their field of study. And so I'm very, very thankful to have both of them. That is Stephen Hoyt and Steve McRae. They know how to drill deep, that is, into the substance of this and that when it comes to philosophy and epistemology, etc. And so we're going to be talking about what is atheism, really, question mark. We're going to move on from that and talk about other things, but I'm going to be sitting back, picking up this orange and enjoying the conversation, because this is not going to be a debate. I mean, this is not a debate at all. And so many people look forward to the tension of debate, but this is not a debate. This is going to be a discussion between two extremely intelligent individuals who have done their research, and I'm thankful for that. And so if that's your cup of tea, hang in there. And I would like to ask all of you guys a favor, if you will. Please don't share with me the score that is between the Patriots and, yes, the Kansas City Chiefs. I'm pulling for Mahomes. He's my favorite quarterback, and I have it being recorded on DVR, so after the show I can watch it, and I can be surprised as to what the outcome might be. But I'm really excited about that, but more excited about this show tonight. With that said, welcome, Daryl.
Well, thank you. All I can say about the game is you're going to be happy. You'll just have to wait and see.
I was really disappointed that the Saints got the bad call. They're just, what was it, on the 5 or 4 yard line? I mean, that guy really, did interfere with that wide end receiver. I mean, that was a bad situation. He really
interfered in helmet to helmet. You could have called either one or both.
Yeah, that would have given them a first down. That would have run out all of the seconds on the clock. And number 2, they would have scored 3 points, won the ball game. But in a sense, we have the Rams who won by default of that particular situation. That was sad. And so that team shouldn't be going to the Super Bowl, but who am I to judge football? This is my first year back watching football again. I haven't watched it since the mid-'70s. I was a big fan of football back then, and I'm jumping back into football simply because I'm really tired of Fox News and CNN and MSNBC. I don't think that we have competent journalists any longer, and so I'm enjoying some of the sports journalists because they really are getting into the science of the game. With that said, welcome, Stephen Hoyt.
How are you?
I'm doing marvelous, wonderful. I'm really tickled pink, to say the least, or tickled orange. I'm excited about this show tonight, simply because it's going to be substantive. And so, what are your thoughts? Where are you guys going with this show?
Yeah, I can't wait either. It's always fun to talk to somebody that knows what they're talking about. And Steve's got some great ideas that he's going to share with us and to everybody that's watching. So look forward to it.
The thing that I need to really say up front, they're not going to go full circle. They're going to start the conversation. And yes, you're going to have a lot of questions that are not answered. And I promise you, these two will be back. But with that said, welcome, Steve McRae.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I'm very actually flattered. I've been wanting to come on this channel for quite some time and just love you guys and have the utmost respect for all of you. So thank you very much for inviting me tonight.
I tell you what, we love you to the moon and back. And I think that, that picture in the background is wonderful. I love that with all the colors.
It's gorgeous. Yeah, I love my green screen. It kind of reflects my mood. This is kind of my somber, kind of reflective mood. So.
Yeah. How long have you had the goatee?
I've had my goatee off and on for several years, actually, but it used to be a lot darker and a lot longer. And I actually had a full year, but it didn't really work for me. So I cut it down to this and just kind of keep it somewhat trimmed.
I keep telling people that my hair is still blonde, and some believe that and some don't. But, it is what it is. So let's move on. Let me give it to you, Stephen Hoyt. You guys go for it, and I'm going to sit back, and when I have a question or so, I'll jump in.
Yeah, well, Yeah, I've got a lot to say about Christian apologetics. It's a sad state of affairs, and I don't think it'll be hard to get, unless you're a Christian apologist, I don't think it'll be hard to get anybody else to agree with me on that. But it's been received in a reactionary style, I think, from atheists, and it causes some problems when you think things through. For instance, Christians will often want to, they think that there's something wrong with faith or belief per se, and they can't shy away from using the word and all the connotations with it. So what they want to do is try and get somebody else in bed with them and say, well, you're in the same boat I am. And so atheists try and do their best to stay out of that same boat, when really it's just not a good argument to begin with. One of the concerns that I have, and is the topic tonight, is this idea that atheism is just a denial that the proposition God exists, just the denial that that proposition is true. Doesn't say anything about what I do or don't believe, other than I don't think that proposition is true. There are lots of reasons I could think that that proposition is not true. One of them is simply that I reject it because no one's offered enough evidence for me to agree that it's true. So I could reject it on that front. It could be that I don't think that God is a term that makes sense. If there's a transcendent deity that is different from everything that I know, well, then my human language cannot signify anything about it. So even if it does exist, all of my God talk has no referent. So it may be that I'm agnostic, that my God talk is literal nonsense. It doesn't represent anything. So that might be a reason why I reject it. It could be that I think that it's a metaphysical proposition. It's not truth-bearing. So when someone pretends that it can be true or false in some meaningful way, then I reject it because I think it's a metaphysical proposition. These are how different, there's lots of other ways you can relate to the proposition, but I have an attitude about the proposition itself, and it doesn't really belie what my beliefs are about whether or not there are gods. And some atheists say that that's sufficient to have the definition of being an atheist. And on the other side, there are those that actually believe there are no gods. And so initially when Steve and I were talking online about this, my initial thing was, well, okay, if we take the first definition that I explained, I would be an atheist. It would be because I'm agnostic. I don't think that anything that's transcendent can be known. And there's, for the same reason, I'm also agnostic, because if something is absolutely beyond our comprehension, then nothing that we say about it can be true in any kind of meaningful sense. So I reject any proposition that's supposed to be about God. However, I myself actually do think that there is something like a God. So that's a doxastic belief or an attitude about a state of affairs. And then the other is how I think about the proposition itself, whether there's anything meaningful to talking about that intuition that I have. And so in my case, I presented to Steve a couple of weeks ago that it would be consistent for me to call myself an atheist theist, as long as, or just in case, we accept the commonly given definition of what an atheist is. Personally, I don't think that that does justice to why we have labels to begin with. And I really do think that an atheist is someone that does have a belief about a state of affairs, and that belief is that there are no gods. That would make it a consistent use, where I am a theist and I cannot be an atheist. Where on the other case, I can be an atheist and I can be at the same time a theist. So on the show is Steve, and we wanted to kind of flesh that out and maybe get into some auxiliary and ancillary topical matters. I know Steve has talked about this for hours and hours, weeks and weeks on end, and I haven't, which good for me, because the conversation to me is really not as interesting as I think what Steve engages with, but I'd love to pick his brain on what other thinkers that are atheists are saying. I know you've talked to Ozzy, you've had on your show before, lots of other guests, and they've all expressed different opinions and spent hours grueling through this. So on this take, maybe we can condense some of that knowledge that you've gained at least on how people are perceiving things, and then share it here. So what are your thoughts?
Sure. First, let me say that I actually had dark hair when I started talking about atheism. So that tells you how long I've actually been at it.
That's
There's a lot
cool.
to unpack in what you said. There's clearly like 12 different topics that you had just mentioned in your opener there. The first thing let me talk about real quick about your thing about what you said about belief. And I agree with you. I think a lot of times the theist wants to level the playing field by saying, you know what, we believe that there's a God and you have some kinds of beliefs as well, which everybody has beliefs. I know there's a few slight group of people out there that want to run this narrative that, oh, I have no beliefs, right? I call them dosastic nihilists because they just for some reason believe, well, it's weird, kind of, they believe they don't have beliefs, right? Which leads to this weird infinite regress kind of thing. But everybody has beliefs, so they are really have this aversion to that word belief or even to faith, and I think that's a bad way to go about having a discourse, because most words are polysemous, most words have different usages, and if I want to use that word in a meaningful way, like I have faith that my daughter will do well in school, or I have a belief of this or that, then there's nothing wrong with that. It's not using it the same way as in blind faith, or it's not the way the theist may be using it. So there's different ways that we can use these words. As far as atheism, for years on the internet, people have watched these shows, which I have as well. And a lot of the atheist shows put out this narrative, of course, that the only way you can define atheism is merely non-theism, that the non-belief that there's gods, saying that I do not believe the theist, I reject their claims, that kind of narrative. And that is fine for a colloquial sensu lato type definition, a very broad definition, if they want to use it for their organizations. American Atheist, for example, has that on the very first page on their about. It says, atheism is the non-belief, or atheism is the position that you don't have a God belief. Not that you believe that there are gods, but you don't have a God belief. These are positions that these organizations put out only because they want to have people under that umbrella, the auspice of the title of atheism, right? Because they're trying to expand their base. And I get that. However, people are now finding out that they're not putting out all the fullness of the information, that in philosophy, and when you go to read a paper, if I see the word atheism, 9 times out of 10 or even greater, it's going to be referring to, as Steve said, the belief that gods don't exist. And I think people now are awakening to that. My position has always been this: you can use words as you see fit. Words have usages, I mean, more than just meanings, right? That's who is it? Matt Dillahunty always says that, words don't have meanings, they have usages, which I think they still have meanings, but they of course have usages. So if they want to use the word that way, that's fine. But the argument has been they try to subsume all other beliefs or non-beliefs under that one heading. And as agnostics, people say, hey, look, I don't have a position either way on this topic, and you're labeling me something that I don't fall into merely because you're just having this overreaching label called atheism that you're ascribing anybody who doesn't have a God belief to it. I've been telling people that it doesn't have to be the case. Now, if you want to subscribe to their kind of a paradigm, right, to their schema, you're more than welcome to, right? I've never gone off and said to anybody, look, you're not a true atheist. You're not an atheist because you don't have a belief that gods don't exist, right? But people have ascribed that to me, and it's very infuriating because I have a page actually of my positions, and that's not one of them. I don't tell people what to label themselves, what to identify as. And my argument's always been there are other options. There are more philosophical, more academic, more sensu stricto or strictissimo ways of thinking of these words. And as Steve points out, it is ubiquitous in philosophy, or well understood, that if you see the word atheist, it is ought to be understood as the belief that gods don't exist. That's all. My argument's just been people have a right to label themselves as they want. But I think that you see a lot on the internet of people asserting that you must be either a theist or an atheist. And that's clearly not the case when you use more academic, more formal definitions. Agreed, Steve?
Oh, completely. And I kind of take the low-hanging fruit and do examples by, Bigfoot. What's my relationship to thinking Bigfoot exists, or people that are asserting things about Bigfoot? Really, if I don't care enough about the subject, what am I? Because I don't care enough about it to believe it or to deny it. So how I feel about it is pretty apathetic, and it's so much so disinteresting to me that I don't form a belief. So we're talking about belief formation in my relationship to a state of affairs and to what people are talking about when they talk about that state of affairs. So those are those two different prongs they have in philosophy specific names to them. I'm trying to keep things simple. So, I don't really care if there's a Bigfoot. People argue back and forth, and I just sit on the sidelines. I just don't care. And I'm getting to the point when we're talking about theism that I really don't care either there. It's just that I also have this nagging feeling that something like God exists. And that maybe when I'm trying to make heads or tails of it, then that takes on a meaning in my life when I actually try to live out those beliefs. I think that's what's most important about anything that we do, which is not necessarily, can you justify atheism? Yeah, pretty easy. Can you justify even Christianity? Yeah, I think so in a lot of different instances. Are there problems doing so with either? Yeah, I think with either one, you're going to run into problems. So what really, at the end of it, I'm still going to probably believe something that I came into the fight with. I might later change my mind, but I'm going to leave the engagement thinking pretty much the same way about it as I came in. And to the world, it's those beliefs that I take into the world. And that's the part of the great debate that should be brought into it. What's the value, the practical value of believing that there's a God or believing that there's not? If we're talking about a metaphysical proposition, then we are trying to infer things the best that we can. What makes sense of our experience? So I often see atheists being blamed that they aren't accounting for enough. And then the atheist is turning around and saying, well, I think you're accounting for way too much. And that's the way that it breaks down. But what the problem is each one is making that judgment from their impressions of the world. So of course the atheist thinks that the other guy's is accounting for too much. And of course the theist says that the other guy's shortchanging the argument. There's just got to be more to it and those sorts of things. But, if we hold that as just an uninteresting question, what does atheism, as a result of holding the idea that we are here on our own and there's no big other, there's nothing after we die, what's the effect of that on your life? And can you make it count? I'm sure we would want atheism to count for something. And the same thing with theism, we want it to count for something. But that kind of gets back to an area maybe branch off on into something that you thought was maybe a little bit more interesting. And it's the different discussions that branch out from the topic of do gods exist? And the first thing to discuss, which I'm trying to hint at, is when we're talking about something, it has to have something has to be at stake in order for it to matter in some practical way. So again, if I'm apathetic to whether or not there's a Bigfoot, I'm not going to be developing any beliefs. I'm not going to be skeptical. I'm not going to be, I just don't care. Same thing with the God debates. What's at stake? And that's really what we have to talk about in terms of the great debate is to first say, what is at stake if there is a God? What's at stake if there's not a God? And it can't be just threats of heaven and hell. How does it impact your daily life to accept or reject the idea that there's gods? Or your impression of the world that includes or does not include an impression of something else in the world. So something at stake in the argument, and I assume because you and I are here that we think something is genuinely at stake, whether or not you believe that there's a God. And from that, how do we communicate especially when we have differences? What are our responsibilities to one another as social beings engaged in a conversation? And I kind of wanted to punt that into your direction. I know you've been, past couple of weeks, you've said you've looked into what are called speech acts. And this kind of goes back to where we first started, which is when I talk about faith, I'm going to pull you into my boat. So what's another reactionary thing other than to say, I don't have any beliefs? Rather than, you've got the book, it takes more faith to be an atheist or whatever that stupid thing is. It doesn't take, anyway. The other thing is, well, the reaction to that is other than I don't have a belief, the other reaction is not only that, but you're the one making assertions. Theism is an assertion. which you and I are about to discuss, that's not the case, given speech acts. But the other thing is the defensive mechanism of non-believers often is, I don't have any responsibility in this conversation because I didn't bring it up. That's essentially what it is. You want to give us a little bit of background on that trajectory?
Sure. There's a couple things there. First, when you started, you had talked about a lot of things that were used for justificatory reasons, right? You had mentioned things like, well, I'm not given enough evidence, therefore I reject the claim of theism. And these are fine. I happen to call that evidential agnosticism, right? But people will say, well, I'm an atheist because I just don't have enough reasons to be a theist, right? I'm not convinced that the claim is true. I have no justification to adhere to theism and to say that gods exist. And I get that, right? And I think you can justify things that way. I think the problem is that when people say that things are not justifiable, like I've had people say, well, is atheism justifiable? And of course it is, right? I mean, anybody can justify having a position that gods don't exist. If they know a lot, I say a little bit about the topic, not a lot, but a little bit about, if they make a good argument as to maybe a probabilistic argument, given things like logical problem evil, evidential problem evil, argument from divine hiddenness. If you have a probabilistic argument that is more likely the case that gods don't exist, I think you're justified to say, I believe that gods don't exist. But a lot of people don't want to take that responsibility on, right? Either they're not familiar enough with the discussions, they haven't been around enough. And I think a lot of people are very fearful to say their actual positions. While they might believe there are no gods, they might actually physically, psychologically think that might be the state of the affairs of the universe. But they're not willing to put that out there as this illocutionary force that says, I am making a definitive statement that there are no gods. Even though when you say something along those lines, like I believe there are no gods, you are making a claim against the affairs of the universe. But as you said, there's a difference when somebody's asking your opinion over making some kind of claim using a representative type speech act. So like I believe is a representative type of speech act. If I say, hey, Stephen, do you believe this or this? And you say, I believe that aliens exist. Immediately, I can't really go to say, well, where's your evidence for that, right? Because you're not really asserting it in a way that I'm taking it where you have a burden of persuasion to say, I'm saying to you, I believe there's aliens exist, and here's my burden of proof for that, right? Because I'm merely asking your opinion. And I don't think there's a lot of esoteric force behind that statement of this self-assessment or autobiographical assessment of yourself saying, hey, yeah, I believe that aliens exist, when I'm just merely asking your opinion. Now, I don't know how that actually works under speech act theory. Again, I've just been in the last couple weeks, looking into speech act theory. But the way I read into speech act theory, you don't have that onus if you're just really just answering a question. And I think that when you get into the discussions with a theist, a lot of them play this entrapment game. They want you to make a claim, because as soon as you make some kind of claim, what they perceive to be a claim, they will pounce on that, right? And atheists do it as well. It's not just theists. I mean, a lot of these shows we watch, that's the whole motif of the show, is to have the theist come in, and the theist says something, and as soon as they say it, well, okay, where's your evidence for that? Well, we all know that if somebody could actually demonstrate there's a God, we wouldn't be having these discussions. I mean, clearly, if that was the case, that it is demonstrable and has been, then we probably wouldn't be having these discussions. These shows wouldn't exist for the most part. So that's what they want you to do. And I do understand that, but I do find it to be a little disingenuous in a way that, as you started off, we want to know about people's beliefs. We want to know why you believe a certain position, right? We want to know about epistemology. We want to understand what you consider to be knowledge, why you think you know something. And just by saying, well, I don't believe this, I don't believe you, I don't believe the theist, anybody can do that, right? And yes, that does have what I call to be a second order burden of justification, but it's trivial, right? You can just charge it, just as you said before, well, I have not been given enough evidence to really determine if this is true or false, therefore I'm just suspending judgment on it, right? The agnostic on the proposition position. And that's fine. I have no issue with people doing that, but I think the problems I run into is that they do this dishonestly, because I know a lot of people that do actually believe that there are no gods, but they don't want to get in that trap game with the theists, that they call it. They think that they're being manipulated by the theists to bring everybody down to their level. Like, for example, using the word belief or faith the same way. And so I understand why they don't want to make claims, but I think that, in my opinion, just by answering a question, well, I believe there's a God, or I believe there's not a God, you don't have an automatically attached burden of persuasion to that. I'm not trying to persuade you to my side. You asked a question, I answered it. And I don't think there's a real elocutionary force attached to that in that regard. There might be a perlocutionary force that maybe I'm trying to persuade you, which is kind of like a secondary thing to that statement. But I don't think that's an automatic thing that's attached to it.
Yeah, makes sense. And maybe I'm gonna simplify things as easy or as as base as I can get it. You and I are having a conversation, and we are, let's say, we're fans of cats, and you and I in particular are fans of Siamese cats, and we're in a convention with a group of people that love Siamese cats. And I stand up, I'm asked to give a speech, and I make the claim that Siamese cats are the most wonderful cats in the world. That I'm communicating a fact about a state of affairs, and that state of affairs has nothing to do with me. It's about Siamese cats. So in that instance, I'm not going to have a burden of proof, even though I'm making an assertion. And why is that? We have to look at the nature of what onus is. It's not like a law of the universe. Onus has something to do with conversation and polite conversation. So anybody saying, well, you've got a burden of proof that you're not meeting, if you understood it, you're just saying, well, you're being very rude in this conversation. Honestly, that's what onus is it only occurs when someone is making an assertion in a conversation where it causes disagreement. And what we want in a conversation is a nice, smooth flow. So if I am in with you in a cat convention, and I like Siamese cats, and you don't, you like, I don't know, I don't even know another kind of cat.
Tabby?
Whatever, mixed around. Okay, and I go, I'm asked to give the same speech, and I say, Siamese cats are the most wonderful cats in the world. There are going to be some people that kind of cock their head to the side and go, well, hold on. And at that point, I've got to explain myself, because I'm not, I've got an onus, and now somebody's calling me on it because they want to know how it is that I have the right to say that. And when we're talking about truth and we're talking about assertions, we're not talking about some ontological thing. I'm trying to, when I assert something, I am making a claim that a state of affairs is exactly this way. So when I assert something, let's say you ask me what my opinion is on Siamese cats. You're not asking me about a state of affairs that has to do with Siamese cats. You're asking what my personal feelings are. And I don't have any burden of proof to tell you, other than you taking my word for it. When I say I believe that Siamese cats are the greatest things in the world, the question is about my belief. It's not about the cats. So you're asking my relationship to that subject. So when I just say I'm a theist because I have a belief that there are gods, then I'm not asserting anything except for what my belief is. The subject is myself. The subject is not whether or not there are gods. Now, if I turn around and say there are gods, and you better believe it, or something like that, well, I've changed the subject. I'm talking about a state of affairs about the world. And in that case, I have a burden that I need to give the reasons for that grant me the right, that ought to grant me the right to say something like that unchallenged. So in general, that's my understanding of the difference between assertion and disclosure. When I'm disclosing what I believe, it's not an assertive act. It's telling you how I feel about a state of affairs versus telling you what a state of affairs are. There's lots of different speech acts that you can have. I think if anyone wants to follow up and Google that, they'll immediately run into Grice and at least his 4 conversational maxims, but he's got a lot of writing on how conversations go. But there's a lot of people that have contributed to that over the years, and it's well worth understanding, especially when we get into these subjects where people take the most stupid rhetoric tactics that don't mean anything to try and avoid justification. if I have faith, I can justify my faith. It's simply because I'm not going to have faith if I can't justify it. So if I'm unwilling to say that I have a belief, it's probably because I have no way of justifying it. But if I have a way to justify it, then I ought to be upfront with saying, here's what I think, and here are the reasons leading me to think so, and that sort of thing. And then people ought to be charitable enough not to try and hook you into their way of thinking or assume you into any other kind of thought that isn't your own, whether that's being called an atheist when really you're an atheist, or you're saying that you have faith too. If you're a Christian, blaming or accusing an atheist of that. Most ridiculous kind of stuff going on at all. And that's just because people, it seems to me at least, that people are doing that because they just don't know how to justify what they believe or what they think. And it's really a simple thing. If you think about why you believe, and if it doesn't have any reasons for it, then you probably ought to jump out of the conversation until you get some, because you're just, talking about stuff that you want to opine about. But who cares about your opinion? Everybody's got one. So anyway, what do you think?
Well, I would probably diverge with you a little bit on this. First, I would call what you're talking about would be with expressives. Expressive is something along the lines of saying, like, I adore cats, right? I'm making an expressive comment, an attitude toward a specific attribute of the universe, right? So I say that I adore cats. That's an expressive statement, a speech of the speech acts. But I think that when you say something along the lines of, like, for example, like we'll use the old adage, the cat is on the mat, right? Since we're talking about cats. If I say the cat is on the mat, I am making an assertion that it is the case in the universe that the cat is on the mat. I think that there is an assertive force behind that, saying that that is the state of affairs of the universe. However, where I would separate that from is, I don't think that mathematically attaches an onus that you have to demonstrate to somebody that is the case, right? That I think where the Speech Act, there's a difference between just making a claim of saying that I believe this is the case, which I do think is determinate upon what fact of reality exists. If you want to go into like essentialism, where there's some fundamental, distinct, discriminate thing in the universe, some fact of reality that a proposition refers to, or you go to more theory of correspondence theory of truth, right? What is truth? Well, some fact that corresponds with that particular truth. So if you go into like essentialism, then when you're saying that the proposition, the cat is on the mat, if you're saying it's true, you're saying that you believe that proposition is true. You're saying that it is the case that the cat is on the mat. So I do think there's a relationship between your belief and ontology there of what the actual case is in reality, given that the fact is the cat is on the mat, right? So the difference is, though, if I'm not trying to persuade you of that, right? If I'm not saying, hey, Stephen, the cat is on the mat, you better believe that, then I have no onus of a burden of persuasion. This goes back to the burden of proof. There's different types of burden of proof. There's evidential burden of proof, and there's epistemological or epistemic burden of proof. They're completely different things. In a court of law, an evidential burden of proof would be either the burden of production or the burden of persuasion, where do I have enough evidence to bring something to the judge, the court, right? That's the burden of production. Do I have enough evidence to convince a jury? The burden of persuasion, right? I'm trying to persuade them to say that my client is guilty or innocent, depending if I'm the prosecuting attorney or not, or the defense attorney. So it really depends on what you mean by burden of proof or justification. In this particular case, we're only talking about epistemic burdens, right? My burden to justify my particular belief. And the way I would do that is that the fact is the cat is on the mat, right? I believe that the cat is on the mat. I have a discrete thing of reality. The fact is the cat is on the mat. So in truth, the correspondence theory, it is true that the cat is on the mat. Therefore, that it substantiates my belief. I think that all kind of weaves in with each other. But I definitely disagree that when you say something along the lines of that, I believe that the cat is on the mat, or I believe any state of affairs, I believe the cats are the best, animal on the planet. I do think that you are making a assertic or assertoric statement in regards to what is the ontological case. Does that make sense?
You're maybe trying to reframe it. Think about our own use of the word belief in the sentence, and that might make things clearer. So if I assert that the cat is on the mat, Well, first, let me back up. It's going to be consistent all the way from just a mere opinion that I have a belief that something is true, all the way through. The belief is held all the way through, even when I have epistemic justification. So at all times, when we're committing any speech act, we are saying what we believe, as long as we believe it. So there's nothing that's going to magically change when I assert it's a fact that the cat's on the mat. Even if it wasn't a fact that the cat was on the mat and I just believed the cat was on the mat, even if it were a fact, I would still be believing that the cat was on the mat. So just a small distinction to set up this common use that you'll hear people say. When I assert, I'll say the cat is on the mat. When I say I believe the cat's on the mat. More interested in there's what I think is going on in the state of affairs versus I am asserting knowledge about what the state of affairs is. The difference is when we use ourselves as, well, I believe, it's to reduce the responsibility I have as a person in a conversation to make riffs in that conversation. The more ripples that I make in a flowing conversation, then the more responsibility I have to smooth those over. So in talking to you, if I say, there's a Bigfoot, well, we may have immediately some big riffs in our conversation. But if I approach it this way and say, I believe, it's a personal belief, that there are Bigfoots, it's not gonna ruffle your feathers much. You might then just go, well, I know that there are people that, and just let it go. So the one of the differences when I say I'm disclosing, when I say I believe that, I'm disclosing what my disposition is about some subject. I'm not saying that subject has any particular relationship to reality. I'm saying what my relationship to it is epistemically. So I believe it, or I know it, or those kinds of things I'm disclosing my disposition towards that proposition. And the other part of that is whenever I do assert, I'm taking it out of a personal relationship with my what I think and make of a proposition. I'm putting it right in your lap and saying, this is the way it is, and now you need to believe it too. At that point, that's when, if you don't agree with me already, then I'm going to have to offer you something to get you to agree. Otherwise, you can just throw it back in my lap and say, nah, it's not sufficient, which is where we get into the conversation about what makes an atheist an atheist. Because it makes a good deal of sense to say an atheist is somebody that just doesn't buy into the proposition because the proposition is either shit or it hasn't been justified, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think there's like, for example, going back a little bit, when you say something that is just constitutive, when you just say something that is just the case, right? It's just the case that I happen to like cats. It's just the case that the cat is on the mat. I still believe that you yourself, you have to have some kind of reasons for saying that, right? I don't know how much elocutionary force is behind that as far as trying to demonstrate that, right? A lot of people will say, what if you just have a just case? It's just the case. There is no onus. There is no force behind that. And I see that. I do see why that would be the case for that kind of declaration, but because it's just a simple utterance, right? A simple utterance may not be you making an esoteric force behind it. You're not saying I'm asserting this to be the case. You're just answering a question, kind of thing. So it's a very fine line to me, when it comes to speech acts, of what it takes to say, are you making a claim? Are you saying, you believe? Are you saying that it is the case that this is the way the universe is? My thing is this: let people just assert what they want to assert, and if they're not making it as an assertion, or assertion, then you know what, they have real no onus to demonstrate to you. Because what I find to be the case is every time somebody wants to get into these discussions, they always want somebody to make some kind of definitive statement, right? Well, I'm not going to make it a claim here. I'm not going to say that I believe this. I'm not going to do anything that puts the burden onto me. And I find those discussions to be boring as crap, right? Because they never get anywhere. Nobody wants to put anything on the table. And in the great debate community, it's just the opposite, right? I am always out there putting things out there. I could be right, I could be wrong, but I'm putting things out there to be evaluated. And when I do that, I do have an onus to explain why I believe those certain positions. And if somebody convinces me, you know what, that is not a good position to have, or somebody tries to change my mind because of their persuasive ability, right? The ability to persuade, then I'll take that on board and go, okay, they met their burden of persuasion. I've changed my position. But not everybody has a burden like that. Going back to what you were saying about atheism, most people I know that believe there are no gods are willing to put forth that they believe it and give arguments for it. But there are some that just will not. They will never go into a theist discussion saying, well, I'm not going to tell, they'll say, I'm not going to tell them I believe there are no gods. Well, why not? Well, because then I have a burden of proof. And I'm like, well, so what? they think it's some kind of magical limit that they can never achieve, when a burden of proof just means, in this case, because it's epistemic, do you have reasons to warrant your belief? Do you have reasons to believe why you believe it? And they deep reasons, right? And
yeah, one of those real simple is just the simple response that there's nothing compelling that anyone has ever told me to warrant me changing my mind. And maybe it helps to talk about, when we talk about the voluntary nature of belief, getting to, I think most philosophers, most psychologists, and in neuroscience, they're discovering, it's been long believed, but I think in factual evidential terms, in neuroscience, we're coming to actually see that we have no, the reasons that we give to justify what we believe are not necessarily related at all to why we believe something. So in philosophy, you have to really concern yourself with psychology too. A belief forms because we're geared to producing reliable, usable inferences. And if that's our starting point and we're inferencing something, and this is what our belief is, then we can only talk about it with another person in terms that might not even relate to why we hold a belief. So when you get like street epistemologists saying, well, isn't reliability important? Well, it's kind of built into our inferencing mechanisms at play. Are they reliable? Well, in a functional sense, yeah. But all of that to say, if we don't have any kind of voluntary nature to belief formation, then we have to really wonder about what it is that we're doing when we try and say, here's why I believe something, because it's not necessarily true at all. That's why we believe it. So what we're trying to do is say, this is what makes sense of why I hold this belief, and it gives me a right to hold that belief, I think. But at the end of the day, we can set those aside and just admit on either side that I do or don't believe something is the case. And that's just a brute fact. Something outside of these arguments is going to have to be compelling. It may be one of the arguments that changes our mind, but it has to be something outside of our willingness to change our mind that's going to actually change our mind. So when we engage in these conversations, it's seeds for later, but I don't think anybody's ever changed their mind because of a rational argument. There has to be something that actually is compelling in some other terms than just pure intellectualness. But that too just goes on, and we can aside that and say, what are we doing when we have this conversation at all? And what is it we're trying to accomplish in having it? And it's got to be something more than just looking at somebody else and saying, essentially, you're stupid, or your beliefs are crazy and it makes you do crazy things and things like that. We can do away with the question of God. This is why I originally said I'm getting really disinterested just in talking about, does God exist? Because we have to get into the more meaty part of it, which is, what do we do with this whole conversation? If I think you're crazy, it's not because you're an atheist. It's because the shit that you're doing in the world. And it's the same way with my with myself, somebody else looking on with me. It's not because I'm a theist that people think I'm a dumbass. It's because I'm actually a dumbass. So what is it in my beliefs that is openly able to be criticized because it actually has something to do with my beliefs, which actually make me do things in the world? If religion is just a prop or a dressing to my racism, then religion is not the problem. My racism is a problem. So how can we begin to address any real issue if we keep fighting about these stupid things like just conversational maxims You know, if I'm having a polite conversation with you and I assert something and we're going to go all out and, well, you know, you need to justify this and that sort of thing. Well, so what? Ultimately, what does it get you? What we're trying to do when we have the God debate is establish just reasons for having a specific idea, not just an idea in general, but granular enough where it has a practical effect on our lives and the lives around us. And we have to, I would think that we would spend more time there because there's more at stake at that level of conversation than just the generic idea of there's some other ultimate reality behind the one that we can viscerally experience. And we never get there because we the ball. I think maybe 90% of the people that are in the gods debates shouldn't be in them. If you can't give a reason, if you can't have a rational conversation on your own without criticizing someone else and their shortcomings and what they believe, then I don't think that you have some conversational right to enter the conversation. So, you know, it might be just a different set of ethics that I go with, but for myself, I have to be able to. I sleep better at night, being able to argue definitively on any side of the case, whether it's as an agnostic, as somebody that's apathetic, or as a theist, as a deist, or as an atheist. I ought to be familiar with the material enough to take a position, even if it's not my own, and justify it. And if I can do all of that, then that gets me grounded into the center, the heart of it. Why? What's at stake with the entire conversation going on? And if people don't care about that part of the conversation, I think they ought to stay out of it, because all they're doing is going to be appealing to philosophies they have no idea about. I think probably you and I, maybe, and of course, Dr. Jones is a linguist. I think maybe we're the only ones here tonight that's ever even heard of perlocution or locution or speech acts, or that there is a difference between disclosing what I believe and asserting what I believe. You know, those kinds of things most people don't care about. And what they care about generally online, and it's really sad, is that the other guy is on the other side and he's stupid. You know, so anyway, that's kind of a whirlwind of my complaints about the whole conversation. But maybe it brings up some things that you can more, grapple with better.
Well, I do think people are persuaded by rational conversation, though, because you said something along the lines that rational conversation doesn't change minds or something, and I disagree with that. I think that I've changed minds with people. Matter of fact, I've changed a lot of minds because of rational discourse, because I've been a rational argument, right? And people that want to be rational, right? Not everybody wants to be rational. There are people that just are happy having irrational beliefs. There are people that don't care if their beliefs are justified or not. I've met a number of them. They're happy, they're content with having, some kind of contradiction in their ontology or some kind of belief that they have that they know is irrational. And I think we all do to some degree, right? I mean, we have to admit to ourselves that not all our beliefs are rational. And we also have a lot of beliefs that are just fundamentally unjustified, right? You can have irrational beliefs, like a properly basic belief. But I think these conversations do change minds. But you said something that I really liked. You said something about disclosing your belief rather than asserting your belief, right? I think that's something to be said for that. If I'm just disclosing my particular beliefs, I think it's disingenuous when people jump on that and say, "Oh, well, you have that particular belief. You need to show me why you have that belief." I'm like, no, I don't. I have no onus to demonstrate to you why I have a particular belief, especially I'm just disclosing it. I think that's a problem in the discourse that I see a lot. And you also had something about the God talk, right? Having these conversations, and what are we actually talking about? What's more important? What would happen if gods did exist, or if they didn't? How does it affect our lives? And I think that's a valid discussion to be had. What would you do if gods existed, and what would you do if you don't? But there's still hypotheticals for all practical purposes, because nobody has, in my opinion, nobody knows gods exist or don't. I mean, I do to kind of just subscribe to agnosticism in that regard, in temporal agnosticism, that I really don't think at this moment anybody can have knowledge that gods exist or don't exist in one way or another. Now, they can say it and they can try to justify it, and maybe some cases they think they have, but I think it's very difficult. But you had mentioned something about truth makers earlier and content, right? What are we talking about when we're talking about God? What is the content of that word, right? The atheist says, well, God is meaningless. That the word is meaningless. It has no context to it. It has no content. It is no object or referent of what this thing is is referring to, right? And the theological cognitivists would say, hey, you know what? Because all that God talk is just meaningless, that there's no such thing as a proposition of does God exist, right? The concept of theism and the concept of atheism is just, it doesn't mean anything, right? They're cognitively non-meaningful. And I think what happens is that people try to put all these different positions under that one umbrella. And you had even said before, you don't care about the God talk, right? Which to me, I would label that, and I don't mean you have to use this label, but I would say that would be called like apatheism, right? An apatheist, if somebody says, I'm an apatheist, I know they mean that, hey, they just don't care about the conversation. They don't care about, if gods exist or not, right? And it tells me something about their positions, because when we get into these discussions, that's what we're doing. We're discussing our positions and other people's positions. Now, if you're not that good at these discussions and you don't know the topics, I still think you should jump in, though. I disagree with you there that you say, you have no business being in discussions. I think anybody should be in these discussions because that's how they learn. We all didn't start off understanding these arguments, Matt. 6 years ago, I didn't know anything about these arguments. I was completely naive. I was inept beyond inept. I was like the Matt Slick of ineptitude when it comes to certain things, right? I love you, Matt. He's a good guy. He's just way off in some of his arguments. But we do learn these things, and so the discourse that we have, we want to know people's positions. This is why I argue that I think it is fundamentally more rational to say like something along the lines of what is atheism? Well, it is the position that there are no gods. It is the belief that there are no gods. It is the belief that theism is false, right? Any of those things are fine, because I want to know what your position is. And if you just say, well, I don't have a position, I don't believe one way or another, okay, that's still a position. That's agnostic. But when you say, well, I don't have a position of anything, right? My position is that I have no position. I'm like, well, what does that actually mean, right? What does that tell me about what you actually think? It doesn't say anything. It's a non-position. It's a non-dosastic position for any practical purposes. So what are you trying to do in the discussions? You're not trying to persuade anybody because you seemingly don't have a position. You're not contesting anybody else because you're not providing any reason for why you have a belief or why you don't have a belief, either or. You're not giving the theist any reason to change their mind. So you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose of you being in a discussion? Not you specifically, but anybody who's involved in these things. And I ask myself that question all the time. What is my goal? And my goal is basically to get the information out there and let people decide, and to give good rational argumentation. And hopefully people will agree, or they don't. If they don't, they give me a reason why. And if that reason's good, I take that on board and modify my argument, right? And we get better at the arguments. And I think that's my particular goal, is just to learn these things and get better at them. But other people, I think they have an agenda. I think they have an ideology, and their goal is, you know what? I just want everybody to call themselves this. I want them to all be atheists. I want them all have this label, because they want to, extend the base, increase the base of atheism, or to normalize it, which I get, right? I believe we should normalize the term, but by assuming other groups like agnostic or apatheist or theological cognitivist, which to me is a huge contradiction, or at least category error. Atheism or whatever, it loses the nuance of these positions. It loses the granularity of the fine detail of what it means to have a particular belief. And I don't like shoehorning everything into you have to be black or white. You have to be this or that. You have to be this weird dichotomous relationship that they put into this. But they make a false dichotomy. I had just the other day somebody tell me, well, the dichotomy of agnosticism and Gnosticism. I'm like, well, that's not a dichotomy. And people love to make the dichotomy of theism and atheism. That's not a dichotomy either. They're contradictories, where if one's true, the other one has to be false, right? If theism is true, there is a God, then atheism, belief that the gods don't exist, that would be false. I mean, the ontologically, if God exists, then it's wrong that he does not exist. So there's a contradiction there. So they can't be true at the same time. And one is true, the other one's false. They can't be false at the same time, right? So they can't be contraries. And I think that is a more rational way to look at these discussions. So going into them, we have to look, one, what is your motive for having these discussions? And two, do we want these words to have some kind of normative aspect to them of what they ought to mean in regular usage? And I think that in philosophy, that's already been established. And that's what I do. I tell people, well, in philosophy, how these words are understood when you read them, or what they may be understood. And Gnosticism has multiple things that could be understood, but it doesn't mean just one thing, as they're trying to shoehorn these words to mean, right? And I think you would agree that when people say, well, you either an atheist or a theist, I think that's a fundamentally wrong statement, right? They would only be maybe technically correct if they said, look, in my schema, defining these words the way I do, you can only be theist or atheist. Okay, fair enough. But that it's stipulative, and that's on the condition that you are using their schema, which I think only exists in the realm of internet atheism for the most part. I don't really see it anywhere else. I don't read it in the literature. I don't read it in the books. A few people have proffered it. They've offered it up as this is how it should be, or we want it to be this way, or it ought to be this way, but only as an opinion piece, right? You have Anthony Flew, 1972, Presumption of Atheism. You have Smith in 1974, The Case Against God, and then Steve Bullivant in like 2017 or so. You know, he argues that, you know, atheism should be this non-position, this lack of belief position. But to wrap up my position is that I just want to get the information out there, and I think that as you put it, there's all these different positions out there, atheism and apatheism, and just by saying, well, you know what, those are all just atheist positions, you lose the whole point of the positions themselves. I mean, if you say an apatheist is an atheist, then you're losing the whole nuance of why they're apathetic to begin with, right?
Right. Well, and for me, like the nuance of everything is great, because we're talking about one instance right now. There's two different ways that are commonly used to define atheist. And so one view, only one of those views, leads to a contradiction in saying that I am both an atheist and a theist. Only one of those definitions does. And the
Yes.
one people, reactionary atheists, are trying to give in order to get out of justifying what they do actually believe, they talk about the proposition rather than what they think about the state of affairs, which is, I just deny that when people say that or assert that there are gods, well, I just deny it because they haven't really given me any reason to think so. Well, if I do that, if the reason why I deny that it's not true that gods exist is because I don't think that it's meaningful, it's not a truth-bearing proposition, I've just denied the proposition. Yet on what I actually think about the state of affairs, I still am a theist. So in that sense, you know, that's where I'm saying that they're these reactionary atheists trying to shirk their responsibility with justifying what they think, have muddied the water so much that it's no longer a contradiction to say that I'm both a theist and an atheist at the same time. And I do have to go back and say you're right. Rational arguments do change minds. I wouldn't have been doing this for 20 years if I didn't think so. It's just that it's not a voluntary process where I hear you speak, I consider it, and then I, through an act of will, change my mind about it. Like I said, it's like a seed that's going to have to slowly work its way in and plant its roots and then take root and then push the web of beliefs open enough so that it's got space to breathe and live too. But yeah, rational arguments do change minds. But going back to the nuance thing, I am an apatheist when it comes to whether or not knowing that there's a God makes a difference. I don't think it makes a difference. I still believe that there's a God, so I'm an apatheist in the sense that I don't care about the question. I'm a theist because I think there's a God. But where I also agree with atheists and apatheists is that I still think God talk is meaningful. I realize it has no referent, but the utility is that the fact of the matter is a transcendent God, I can only infer that such a thing would exist. And I understand that my failure to be able to use language to be able to identify what it is that I'm inferring still doesn't negate the fact that I infer something. And so my language, my use of it is to find a practical venting for the implications of what it is that I infer. So in that sense, that's where the meaning comes in. The meaning is not tied specifically to a signified by the signifier. And I think that's where we've lost the boat with most theology, is that faith is having these ideas and living them out. It's not about having the proper beliefs. It's about living out what your beliefs are and seeing how they pan out in the world. That's how we discover any truth of things. And that's how we should be changing our theologies, is whether or not it brings more love in the world. And anyway, that sort of thing, that's where it becomes meaningful.
Yeah, I think though the word I would use would be more apathetic rather than apatheist. Apatheist is somebody, as understood to mean somebody who doesn't accept or reject that there's a God, right? So if you say that you're a theist, you're putting this out there that you're accepting there's a deity, which kind of negates the whole purpose of being apathetic or being an apatheist. But you can say I'm apathetic toward a certain thing. I'm apathetic toward the proposition that it's knowable whether gods exist or not, right? Okay, fair enough, right? Because it doesn't matter whether we can know gods exist or not. Whatever. Again, I don't think that anybody does, but that's a different proposition. But I think that when you throw all these terms together and say, well, I'm an atheist, theist, theological cognitivist, apatheist, it kind of, I mean, I used to do this, by the way. I mean, I understand what you're saying, because 3 years ago I used to define myself as a apatheistic, agnostic, theological cognitivist, right? Which was a mouthful. And I at the time I felt I had enough reason to believe those things. But as I researched it more, I wanted to get a more fine tuning of my positions and realize what that phrase there had issues with it. I had to take on board that it didn't really convey what my particular positions were. And like I said before, going into discussions, that's what our goal is. We want to tell people our positions and discuss theirs. When you talk about the whole atheist theist thing, I've had an argument with that for quite some time, and people can go check it out on www.greatdebatecommunity.com. But I've made the argument using logic that weak atheism equals agnosticism equals weak theism. And it is a semantic argument, and it is based upon the case people using very loose colloquial definitions. So I do understand what you're saying with that, because it is a semantic thing. And the way it would work, the way I would argue it would be like this. If given the proposition of theism, just for brevity, God exists. It should be more like at least one God exists, but for brevity, God exists. Well, the atheist says, well, if you don't agree with that proposition, if you don't ascribe true to that proposition, you are a weak atheist, which they then just kind of boil down to atheist, right? That would be the what Ozzy calls the lack of a belief position, right? Or lack theist. But if you wanted to do that, you have to allow for the mirroring for the theist to do the same thing, right? Or you have a special pleading case. The theist can say, okay, the proposition is gods don't exist. And then the theist says, well, if you don't say that proposition is true, then you are a weak theist, which would they just condense down to theist. So at the same time, if you don't believe that the proposition God exists is true, and you don't believe that the proposition gods don't exist is true, you don't have a belief either way, you are a weak atheist and a weak theist, which actually in philosophy is the agnostic on the proposition. So these are all, logically the same, weak atheism and agnosticism and weak theism, but it's just a semantic game at that point. You really are playing a game with meanings. You're just saying, well, because of this, because of the weak definition, I'm going to call you an atheist, which again, I disagree with strongly, but they have to allow for the theist to do the same thing. And a theist can just as very well say, well, you don't have the belief that gods don't exist, therefore you're a theist. Because if they want to play the game that's a dichotomy, well, if the dichotomy would be, in this case for the theist, that if you don't believe that proposition is true, then not believing it means that you are a theist, because you're not an atheist because you don't believe that proposition is true. So the only other choice would be you're a theist. So I do get your argument, but that's one of the things that you run into when you start using these very poorly defined ways of looking at these words. And I think that when they do that with atheism, and they do that with agnosticism a lot, they define it in a way that just is very loose, and it's not really constitutive of what a person's actual beliefs are. Then you run into these things like that. You run into contradictions. You run into category errors, like theological cognitivist, which is a non-cognitivist position. All of a sudden the atheist is saying, well, you know what? You don't hold a God belief. You lack a belief in God. Therefore, you are an atheist. But the theological cognitivist says, no. The whole propositions are they're not propositions. It's meaningless conversation. I'm not a theist. I'm not an atheist. I'm none of this, right? And so you're just basically negating and nullifying their entire position because you're trying to subsume them under a heading or title of atheism that you want them to have because of your ideology. And I think that my thing in these discourses is to get people to stop doing that and understand that's not how it actually is in philosophy. And if you want to accept these things, it will lead into contradictions. It will lead into irrationality and holding contradictory positions like atheist theism or rocks are atheists. We've all been down that route before, right? But if they're willing to accept that, right? If they're willing to accept that kind of baggage, what are you going to do, right? At that point, they're at least being consistent, right? then my argument is really kind of done at that point. I can't really do much if I can't convince them that I think that's not a great position to have, or kind of irrational, or you shouldn't have contradictions in your ontology. Where do you go from there? But if somebody says, you know what, yeah, you're right, that will lead to contradictions. Maybe I should have a more strict definition or strict usage, right? Then I feel like I've accomplished something.
Right. Yeah, and I think you have. What it typically boils down to when you get to that point where they're saying, well, let's consider a better definition. The immediate thing that they come to is, well, what is it that I actually believe? And then we'll come up with a definition from there. And at that point, you've not been reactionary. Your definitions prior to that have all been reactionary. I don't want to get to relaying or disclosing what I believe, because someone's going to have my ass for it, and then they're going to want justification, all this kind of stuff, and I'll just deny the proposition. Same thing with the atheist, is talking about the proposition itself rather than what they actually think about a state of affairs. And it's a very simple thing to say, I think that there's maybe something more to reality than what we experience in some kind of normal, ordinary sense. And that thing I would call a God. That would be well.
But is that a disclosure? I mean, are you just saying, like, I mean, just the little cautionary act of saying something, like the actual utterance of what I'm saying, doesn't necessarily have to have some kind of force behind it. You agree, right? So you are you just saying that I'm disclosing that as just my opinion, or were you saying something along the lines of, I believe there's a God? Because I do believe that if you say I believe there's a God, there is an attachment there. There is a claim that you're making against reality. It's not just a self-assessment at that point.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think you're again trying to take off heat on what kind of justification you have based on the statement. And think about it this way: I'm going to say the same thing 2 times. I believe that there's a God. And that was unsolicited. I'm just telling you, I believe there's a God. Mm-hmm. Technically, that's disclosure. Now, if you ask me, Steve, do you believe there's a God? And I say, I believe there's a God. It's the same disclosure. And what I'm telling you is what I believe about a state of affairs. But the question is central to me, to myself, to what I make of things. And not necessarily, if here's a good difference. If I say I believe that there's a God, I'm telling you that I am not sure enough about the statement there is a God in order to just drop the belief part. Because I'm acknowledging to you that I lack justification, that if I had it, I would not tell you I believe it. I would tell you this is a fact.
But saying I believe that God exists and saying God exists to me is indistinguishable from each other. Yeah. If I say that I believe God exists, I am making a claim against reality, right? So it's the same thing as saying a more of an assertive way, or assertoric way. I have a problem with that word, assertoric way. Well, I guess I have to ask Dr. Jones about that. Assertic or assertoric, one of you can use either. Go to the expert, right? Right. But you are I think you are making a assertion that it is the case that God exists either way, right? I don't think hedging your bet by saying I think that God exists or I believe that God exists, or it may be the case that God exists. I think a lot of those are just ways of hedging people's bets, because I find when I'm having a conversation with somebody, not you obviously, but when I have a conversation with people that I'm trying to suss out their actual positions, they're very, very qualitative in their disclosures, very, very parsed in how they're answering the questions. And I've noted that a lot of them do that because they don't want to get locked down to an actual position. And I don't think it's dishonest, right? I don't think that they're trying to be dishonest, but they don't understand like the Socratic method. They don't understand why people are asking the questions that they're asking to see if their positions are rational. And it is to get them down to the position. That's what they even tell me. Hey, Steve, can you tell me what my position would be in philosophy? Okay, I'll do my best. But then they'll hedge their bets every single time. Well, it's quite possible this, but there's a possibility here. And we're like, well, these are all possibilities, right? When somebody says that I believe God exists, they're saying, of course, there's a possibility, right? Because to say that there's no possibility requires a very different burden of justification. That's a very different claim to say it's impossible for God to exist, or it's not possible at all for any deity to exist. That's an entirely different claim with an entirely different justification. Very difficult to meet. But if somebody just says, I believe that there are no gods, or I believe there is a God, you are making a probabilistic argument in some way, right? You're not saying I believe it is definitely the case that God exists, right? I'm not saying that I believe it is definitely illogical for God, any gods to exist. Those are all different propositions, right? And people, I think, conflate them all together. They throw them all together and say, hey, well, if I'm making the statement that I believe X is the case, or I believe P is true, that they think for some reason they're making it as a knowledge claim or a claim that cannot be wrong, or has some kind of Cartesian certainty attached to it. And it's very bizarre when I have those conversations, because I'm trying to explain to them, no, we're just trying to get, you know, what you're convinced of, right? And you can have qualifiers for it. Don't get me wrong. You can have quantification of your beliefs. I believe that there's gradient, right? If you over a certain amount, then you can say that you're convinced. And if you're really, really, really convinced, you can say, you know, if you meet, you know, the conditions for knowledge in any kind of a an analysis for knowledge, like JTB or rationalism, or excuse me, reliabilism or something. But those are different grades, right? I mean, the knowledge gradient is higher than a belief gradient, right? The burden for saying I believe is not as much as saying I know, because then you're dealing in what knowledge is, and that's a whole different ballgame. And worse, when people say I can't be wrong, right? You know, there are no gods. It is impossible for there to be gods. They're all illogical. I cannot be wrong. That's a very, very high burden. But you do see it.
Let's kill two birds with one stone, and we will look at what you're nuancing here. We're going to take the words that you were using before and actually lay them out in terms that everybody can understand. Because what you're talking about is the difference between locution and perlocution. Mm-hmm. What is it? What are the words that we're saying in relation to one another to give a meaning? And then what is the effect of that meaning? So just because, like in the example I gave, I said twice, I believe that there's a God. Now, that's under the assumption, it's just a general analysis or general analogy, but under analysis would fail because I might have a different intent with one of those sentences than I do with the other. And so it's completely possible to say that I believe that whatever P is, I believe that P. And it can be because of perlocution that I am uttering an assertion. So it not necessarily because all of the words are there that it's disclosure, but actually the intent of all of the meaning. Am I really talking about what I think, or am I really trying to say what is a state of affairs and just try and back off on what I'm responsible for once I do make that assertion? So those are two different things. And with all of these conversations, the thing that you have to be paying attention to, which people do it the opposite way. They think if I say these certain things, then it's for sure, without a shadow of a doubt, that these are the things that I'm responsible for. So if I don't use the word belief, I won't have any onus. Or if I assert something, then I have an onus. Well, none of those are necessarily true. You have to look at who it is. You have to engage the person you're speaking with. And then when they have objections to what you're saying, your responsibility is to make it okay. You can drop all the other stuff about, well, I just said that I believe that this is the case. I really wasn't saying this was the case. Well, to me, that's bullshit. If I've caused a rift, my responsibility to you as an ethical conversationalist is to make it okay with you. And how do I make it okay with you? But other than to give you why it is that I think the way I do, regardless of whether it's in even if I'm positive, I'm affirming some proposition, or if I'm just saying, listen, I don't buy it. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. Is there an onus when somebody denies a proposition? I think most people, most atheists especially, will say, look, if I deny something, it doesn't mean that I have an onus. I'm just denying something because there's no reason to believe it. Just because you deny something doesn't mean that you have an onus. And a perfect example is something that every atheist is going to get. If 99% of climatologists tell you that the world's going to shit in a handbag and global warming is a reality, and you're the only one that has no information at hand, or it's bad, and you're the only holdout denying that proposition is true, it's not the 99% of people that professionals that they've already given their burden of proof. you now, even though you're denying that climate change or whatever is, you're just denying it, but you have more responsibility than anybody at the table because you are the most ignorant and you're not going on the best information. So the same thing with creationists. If it's a fact that we can observe evolution, and we've got a narrative called the theory of evolution that accounts for the bulk of what's going on, any creationist that stands there and says, no, that's just bullshit, they're the ones with the responsibility to make things okay, because the scientists have done their work. Just because you deny that work is valid doesn't mean that you don't have any onus. Of course you do. So you have to look at, in these God talk conversations, what is the intent? Not what are the details of what somebody's telling me, but what is their intention when they're communicating to me? And so in that respect, you can employ or have a better sense of when to apply the principle of charity. Just say that, you know, I understand what they're going for. They're completely illogical, but I'm gonna set that aside because they're just not used to talking this way, and I'm gonna hear them out. Versus somebody that's should know better and is uttering utter nonsense, that sort of thing.
I think
communicating.
I think originally you said that the person denying doesn't have an onus. Did you mean that they do?
There are cases, most people will say that most atheists will say, if I just deny a proposition, I don't have any responsibility. I don't have any to say why it is that I disagree or that I'm not entitled to disagree. If there's extraordinary claims, then it requires extraordinary evidence. Well, we don't even have, you know, from an atheist standpoint, from A.J. Ayer, best book in the world that you could read on the topic of atheism as a critique would be Language, Truth, and Logic. He rips theists, a good one, in about maybe 3 paragraphs, and almost the other entirety of the book is about crappy atheist thinking. if as an atheist, neither theism or atheism makes sense, then engaging in the conversation brings an onus to the table that both people have. And that's one of the important parts that he talks about. It doesn't make sense to engage unless you become justified to say that the proposition is real and valid. So just because you deny something, it's not a made up rule. There's no rule about if I deny that I don't have no, it's about conversation and who you're pissing off. And if you've got a right to piss somebody off, and the right comes with justification. And if somebody denies that you have the right to say what you're saying, your responsibility is to prove that you have the right to say what you're saying. That's all it boils down to. It's pretty simple, but everybody wants to shirk that responsibility. It's beyond me why they do, other than just to assume, in bad faith, maybe on my part, that people are just idiots with rhetoric and really being in touch with what are good reasons to think the way I do. And if I don't look at it, if I look at it too much, will I stop thinking the things that I do? So let's just not touch it because I kind of like it where it's at,
Well,
So,
some of them may not have reasons why they believe things, but 2 things there. One, as you know, I have an argument that's going around the atheist blogosphere. Matter of fact, just today, I got tagged on a post on Facebook where it had my argument, and the person ran my entire argument verbatim, and at the very bottom said, "I don't know who's this. This is not my argument. I know where it's from, but I saw it somewhere." And it was just on some random page that somebody had tagged me on, and 2 people had actually pointed out, "Oh, that's Steve McRae's argument." So my argument has been getting around that even when you deny something, even when the atheist says, "Well, I reject your claim," I'm saying that I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm not saying that gods don't exist. I just do not believe. That still has an onus. That still has a burden of justification of why you reject that to be rational, right? Because if you think about it, if I say something along the lines of I exist, and you Stephen says, "Well, I don't believe you." Well, that to me is kind of irrational. You need to have a reason why you don't think that I exist, right? And this all goes to the principle of rationality, that we want to have rational discourse. We want to be rational in our thinking. So every position, and even in the dichotomy of believe or don't believe, both of them have some kind of onus, burden of justification. They're quite different in some regards, right? If I make a claim that I believe this is the case, and I'm demonstrating to you that this is the case, I want to persuade you. This goes back to your Prosecutionary Act, right? If I just say, let me think of an example. If you say, "Hey, Steve, what time is it?" Right? And I say it's 3:00, right? So my locutionary act is that I am stating my actual words, it is 3 o'clock. There's no, do I really have something about persuasion there? Is there a perlocutionary act of, am I trying to persuade Stephen that it's 3 o'clock? Well, no. So there's no overreaching argument there. Am I hedging my bet? Am I saying, well, you know what? I believe that it's 3 o'clock, right? Is that the perlocutionary act? Am I expressing doubt in that? It depends, right? If I look at my watch and I say, hey, you know what? I believe it's 3 o'clock. You know, I'm making a statement that I believe is the case of the universe. Maybe I'm doubting my watch is right. Maybe I'm doubting that the battery is still good, right? There might be something along the lines of perlocutionary act that I'm just expressing something more than what my locution is. And I think that's important when we go to these conversations of, we have to ask the people, you know, what are you trying to do here? Are you trying to persuade? Are you just mentioning a simple utterance? Are you just expressing yourself autobiographically? These are all different things that have a different burden to somebody else or to yourself. And I think that people need to stop throwing it all together and start playing this game of gotcha. I do think, though, when you say things like, you know, I think that it's this, or I believe that it's this, or it is the case. I don't really see a real distinction between any of those things. I've heard you before try to argue that if I'm just expressing myself as a response to a question, as in, you know, I'm giving you my beliefs, that you don't have any kind of justification. Well, maybe not to the other person, right? I agree with you there. I agree that if I say, hey, you know, do you believe in God? You say, yeah, you know what, I believe in God. I'm a theist. I don't have the right to really to pounce on you and say, well, you know what, I demand you give me your burden of justification for that, right? I would assume that you have your own reasons for that. And I could ask you, you know, well, why do you believe that? What are your reasons for why you believe there's a God? Your own personal justification. And it's not necessarily a case to persuade me, right? But I am curious about your reasoning. That's the interesting conversations I want to have. Why do people believe what they want? I don't think we get anywhere by these persuasive arguments as far as atheist and theist, because as an agnostic, I don't think there's great arguments on either side. I think that there's some really good atheist arguments, don't get me wrong, and I do think that being a strong atheist is easily justifiable. But for me, I want to be, I'm not at that point yet where I'm comfortable saying I'm justified to saying there are no gods, right? That's just my personal autobiographical assessment of myself and my ontology. But I recognize that there are some good arguments out there, and people can utilize them to hold the position that there are no gods. And if people want to do the same thing with theism, I would be a friendly agnostic. Ever heard of friendly atheism, which is like the position that, you know, okay, you can be rational and be a theist, right? A friendly atheist, they're called. They can be. Theists can be rational in their beliefs. When I hear the atheists go, oh, well, theism is irrational. Well, that is a pretty strong claim. You can't just pass that off as some kind of, you know, I'm just expressing my opinion. I have no onus to demonstrate that. Well, I think there is an onus there. If you're going to say that it's completely irrational for theists to hold a God belief, that's a hell of a claim, in my opinion.
Right? Yeah. Well, here's the funny thing again. If we have maybe stepped back from all the details of this and remember that the whole principle is a maxim of conversation. That's what onus is. It's about conversation. And the presumption is that they should go smoothly. So the easiest thing to say is, when anyone causes a riff in the conversation, it's that person's responsibility to clean it up. So even if, and my best intentions are as an atheist talking to somebody that believes there's a God, if I deny what they're saying and suddenly there's a riff in the conversation because I've denied, I say, well, why don't you explain to me how it should make sense to me? Because right now it just doesn't. And the conversation goes on. I've allowed them a chance to respond with what's, get some skin in the game. Tell me why it is that you're thinking what you do, even if they just disclosed that they believe that there's a God. So I'm learning something about how they think. And then my response to that is something natural. I'm resolving the riff by also saying, well, here are the reasons why. I don't know why these things aren't that you're telling me aren't compelling. Some of them just don't make sense. Particularly, a loving God with the existence of evil. That just doesn't make logical sense. But none of those kinds of things are compelling to me. That's an exchange, and that's the whole thing. If you're entering into the God debates and you are bented towards causing rifts, then you shouldn't be in the conversation. And if you are in the conversation to have an exchange of ideas, then you're going to approach it the same way that I just demonstrated. You're not going to be doing gotchas, like you're not going to be shirking responsibility of, okay, I realize that that you're saying these things and I'm really just sitting back here listening but doubting. I'll go ahead and tell you what I think. And you know, those kinds of things are conversation in good faith. And if you can enter one in that, then we lessen the import that we put on the stupid things, the rhetorical things, like when should I give justification? When do I have to? Well, you're involved in a conversation. You don't have to do anything, but good conversations involve charity. And part of being charitable is making sure that everyone has an exchange, an equal exchange. So, you know, that's the sort of thing that I'm looking for in these kinds of conversations. And I bring up arguments like this to say, here is one thing that being reactionary and not forthcoming in some kind of conversation about God, here's a consequence of it, because it allows me to say things like I'm a theist, atheist, and it doesn't make sense, but it's from a deeper problem that we need to handle first. And then the problem goes away if we just say, when I ask what it is that you believe, you tell me what you believe. You don't tell me what you think about a proposition. You tell me what you think about a state of affairs. You know, and we kind of go from there. We've gone for, there's always going to be some things to say, but we've gone for about an hour and a half. So we might want to start bringing things back to reality, maybe find out what Daryl and Dr. Jones think so far, and maybe we can explore this or another conversation again in the future. This is my first time to talk to you in a chat, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I appreciate you taking the time. It was scheduled for last week. You've been a champ and rescheduled us for this week. We had some problems. So anyway, really appreciate you coming out and talking to us. Daryl, Dr. Jones, what do you guys make of everything?
I think things have been going marvelous, wonderful. I mean, it's been a very good conversation, but I would like to ask both of you guys to put on the table, in brief, could you tell people what belief is?
Yes, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, belief is a propositional attitude that you basically saying that if I have a proposition, for example, like God exists, that it is the case that it's true, right? It is just a propositional attitude toward.
Now, you're talking about in philosophy, correct?
Yeah, well, propositionally wise. I mean, there could be psychological states. As Steve noted, that like atheism could be the psychological state of the belief that God don't exist. But atheism is generally defined, and again, these are just the more ubiquitous ways of looking at atheism, right? When you go read a paper, you see the word atheism, most of the time it's going to be used this way. It's going to be used with respect to the proposition of theism, right? So the proposition of theism being gods exist, atheism would be the negation of that, or the belief that, or that gods don't exist. So if you accept that gods don't exist, you therefore have the belief that that proposition is false. So the beliefs generally are relationship to the proposition, not so much the ontological state. There's a distinct difference between having a psychological position on the ontology and a propositional belief. So if I say that I'm an atheist, you're basically saying that I believe theism is false.
Yeah, this is great because I finally disagree with you on something. So we always have a doxastic, starting with my definition, which is the one that's consistent with usage in philosophy and psychology and other sciences like neuroscience, would be that belief is an attitudinal disposition towards a state of affairs. We will always have a doxastic disposition, but we will not always have a propositional attitude or disposition. So when I say that, when I talk about what the subject is God, I have a belief, doxastic belief about the actual state of affairs. Is there a God that exists? And then I have a propositional attitude, a propositional disposition about the sentence and what it purports to, God exists. So I might not have a specific doxastic attitude about that proposition, or I may. But one thing is for sure is I will always have as long as I'm aware of what the topic is, if the content makes sense, then I will have some kind of belief or doxastic or dispositional attitude about it. And that can be framed with whether it's in terms of how what I make of it internally, without any regard to my discussions about it, which would be propositional sentences and things like that. And it can also include, but doesn't necessarily have to include, the propositional attitudes. So I kind of go with the more broad aspect so that we can always have it apply to everything. So that one would include doxastic attitudes. It would also include propositional attitudes. That would be recognizing there are two different ones. One may not, propositional attitudes might not always exist, but doxastic ones will. And it would be an additional one if we can also say that, well, now that the proposition exists, the sentence, there are gods, I will also have a doxastic belief about that proposition, which is where you can get into contradictions. I believe there's a God, but I don't believe that this sentence expresses anything, that sort of thing. But anyway, so it's always fun to disagree because we get into interesting philosophical questions. So just in general, my understanding is it's an attitudinal disposition, and that includes doubt, because doubt is an attitudinal disposition towards the state of affairs, which means you also have you need to justify your doubts as much as you need to justify what your affirming beliefs are. But anyway,
yeah, but I think it's important. I think it is important to distinguish between some kind of ways something is defined propositionally versus psychologically, right? Because like, especially when it comes to agnosticism is not defined propositionally, right? It's not saying there is a proposition of agnosticism. It's a normative epistemic principle, like the example that the knowledge of God, right? That would be, Huxley would be saying that, nobody can have knowledge of gods, but that normative epistemic principle being a methodological approach that you shouldn't believe anything without sufficient reasons to do so. But those are all different from what agnosticism is generally held to be, which is a psychological position, right? Not propositional like atheism, but it is a psychological position as you described, because for one, you can't really argue psychological positions. You can argue propositions. But the main thing is, if I say that agnosticism is the psychological state of being agnostic on a proposition, right? Now it really is a psychological state. But atheism, I don't really think should be defined that way. I don't think you should look at atheism as a psychological position as much as, propositionally saying that it is the case that theism is false. I just personally, when I see the word atheism, I take it propositionally, not psychologically. Now, I'm not saying that you can't, clearly, but there are reasons to distinguish between propositional and psychological.
Yeah, well, then we're back to where we started, because I'm saying if we just take it as being a position about a proposition, then it makes sense that I can call myself an atheist theist. The only time it presents a real contradiction is when we talk about the doxastic disposition about the state of affairs. Is there or is there not something like a God? If we don't take it proposition, we take it with the actual, this is my psychological, this is the belief that I have about the state of affairs, be it doubt or belief proper, then that's where there can be a contradiction, because I can't at the same time think that or believe that there is a God at the same time that I don't believe that there is a God.
Right. I agree.
Time I believe that there's a God, deny propositions. That's a consequence of saying that atheism is associated with the proposition. That's where I'm disagreeing, and it's about this idea of belief at all, and I'm glad that we.
Yeah, because you can have competing psychological beliefs. People have cognitive dissonance, right? You can hold people. I love the narrative you believe, you don't believe. Now, I have another thing that I put out there, an argument, which, by the way, has not been really reviewed by anybody. By all means, go check it out on www.greatdebatecommunity.com. It could be way off base. I don't know. It's just something I came up with at 3 o'clock in the morning when I write these things. That's why I call it 3 a.m. philosophy. But I thought, is there conditions where you could have a case where you believe and don't believe simultaneously? Yeah, actually, I think that there are cases where you can have cognitive dissonance and you can have compartmentalization. You can have reasons why you hold a belief and don't hold a belief at the same time. There are things that like Moore's law and peculiar reason, which are similar. right? Having a state of affairs such as like, it's raining, but I believe that it's not raining, right? You're making an utterance that it's the case that it's raining, but you don't believe that it's raining. It seems to be, a contradiction type there. But I don't think it's actually a real contradiction. It's an apparent contradiction. But I've read a lot about Moore's law, and it's very confusing about what actually is entailed there. It requires much more in-depth analysis than I can ever possibly get into. But I think that that when you have a propositional state, you don't have those contradictions, right? I think most people would be agreed that if you say, well, I believe theism is true or false at the same time, then you're having a contradiction there. You're violating, laws of non-contradiction.
Then you get into fuzzy logic. That's the thing about philosophy. There's nothing that's ever absolute. So we're talking about semantics and the role of language in our thinking, and really what that has to do with saying something is true. But anyway, we'll kind of pare that back down, and then Dr. Jones, you can kind of take it from here and lead us on. Daryl, I'd love to hear what you thought about everything too.
Daryl, go ahead. What are your thoughts on what's been said tonight?
Well, I'm just going to kind of sum it up from my perspective, and I want to use some extremes. There was something said earlier about being in the same boat, and that I guess that has kind of stayed on my mind throughout the whole conversation. If you deal with the extreme that, and these are things that have been brought up tonight, the extreme position that there absolutely cannot possibly be any kind of superior being or gods of any kind or anything beyond ourselves, anything responsible for all that we know, all that we have perceived thus far. I mean, obviously we haven't gone to the ends of all universes, etc. I would say the verdict's not in there. And also at the same time, all the claims that have been made about gods, obviously the verdict is not in there. The burden of proof has not been satisfied. And it does seem to, everything in between, we're all human beings. We do have that fact. I think most would agree, that human beings are real and we can function. We have the ability to love. We have the ability to be compassionate, to listen to one another, to gain from one another. And so being in the same boat, it does seem to me like that at best, this issue of trying to settle, this God is the true God, because even though there's no proof, and we don't have the verdict in yet, all the evidence and proof that says there can't be any kind of God. So let's talk to one another. I mean, obviously, humanity has solved a lot of problems just by working together, listening to one another. It seems like that should be more where the emphasis is. And, that's the best thing I can say about the conversation tonight. We're talking about these things, and the conversation needs to continue.
This has been a great show tonight. I'm excited about it, but I'm also getting lots and lots of text messages from my wife. She's watching the Kansas City Chiefs and New England Patriots. It's 28-24. Mahomes just scored another touchdown. That guy is good. What are your thoughts on Mahomes? Go for it, Steve McRae.
You know what? I am not a sports enthusiast, so
Okay.
I have nothing to weigh in, to be honest with you. I wish I did. I know so little about sports, you would be kind of appalled at my knowledge. I think on basketball, they use a big orange ball. Football is kind of more elongated. That's about the extent.
Okay,
I
haven't.
honestly, I have nothing to weigh in on it.
To be honest with you, I haven't watched football since the mid-'70s, and this year I got into it simply because I was bored with the news. And so I got into it because I wanted to connect with people I typically don't connect with. And so it's been useful, that is, as a social construct. And so I've really enjoyed this year, just jumping into football and baseball and basketball. And my mother, she's, really old, and she has problems, and she's now watching sports. It's giving her a good pathway into her sunset. So I find some of this stuff really interesting. I've really enjoyed this show tonight. I'm so thankful that you were here tonight. I want to have a show to where I can ask some questions and really get into it. I'm not prepared to do that tonight simply because I wanted to listen to you guys talk, and I think it would be wrong just to go over time. But I've got a lot of questions. I agreed with a lot of what you guys were saying, and I disagreed with a lot of what you guys were saying. I would like to get into a discussion on speech acts. That's a very interesting theory. There are some pushbacks on that particular theory, however. But I'd like to get into usages. I said years ago that words have usage, not inherent meaning, and a lot of people don't get that. In philosophy, what's being done, it's simply setting up a determinate nomenclature to try to make sense of things, and so it just gives people the advantage of getting on the same page quickly. It's not trying to suggest that everything is this way. And we have, for instance, if we're going to talk about truth, how many theories of truth do we have? We have many theories of truth. All philosophers are not on the same page. And so this is a wonderful discussion, and thank you so much for coming our way, Steve. And would you come back soon?
I would love to. I'm honored to do. I was honored to be invited once, to be honored even more to be invited back.
Well, I mean, you're the kind of guy that's open, honest. You really want a discussion to continue, and I think that connection is one of the most valuable things that we can do for the sake of well-being. When we're trying to look out for each other, it's meaningful to start a conversation. So we get both sides of the same coin. We get to view both sides, and so tonight, sitting back and looking at things through your glasses and also through Stephen's glasses, it's been a joy. And this is the thing that I really like about being multi-axial. I realize that everything doesn't rest upon one vantage point or one axis, if you will. And so it's been an honor to have you here tonight. Stephen Hoyt, what are your final thoughts? I mean, you did very, very well.
Yeah, my final thoughts are just a reflection of the entire experience. I've had a great time. And again, Stephen, I haven't really talked to you that much, even just through typing, through Facebook messages and things like that. So I've really enjoyed getting to interact with you and understanding you as a person rather than just some typer of words online. So I appreciate that. And hopefully we can do it again sooner rather than later. So appreciate it again.
I guess it's up to me to say the final thing, but if you didn't agree with any of these gentlemen this evening, maybe you can agree with this. Let's be friends. At the end of the day, argument isn't the issue. It's how well we connect with each other, and then after we become friends, maybe we can have discussions, and maybe we can raise the bar on our discussions and have one of these this versus that kind of conversation. And the reason that's important is that I hope that in my lifetime I see more people erasing this idea of this versus them. And this is the thing that frightens me about the great debate, because I see so many people on both sides, just defending atheism or defending theism, and they become enemies. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And so hopefully we can become friends and do something more positive. Thank you for your time. Good night.